Okay.
Well, we'll go ahead and get started, and thank you all for coming. This is our last seminar for CSTPR seminar for the spring, and we've had a great run. I wanted to say that all of the talks that have been given in this talk today are all archived online, so the webinars are available for viewing. So those of you online that maybe didn't catch an earlier one, you can always go back and watch those again. They're all recorded. So today I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Rebecca Page. She's a master's student in environmental studies, and she's been working with us at Western Water for a year and a half now, almost 2 years, I guess now, doing the project she's going to talk about today. And I've been just really excited about Rebecca's research. I've been really pleased to work with her, and she's just done an amazing amount of research in a pretty short amount of time, I would say. I'll say also that she's a consultant or an affiliate with the consulting firm Adaptation International, which does a lot of work with different communities on climate adaptation, gives them support on vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning and so on. Before she came here, she was a Fulbright Fellow in China, and she did her BA in Environmental Studies and East Asian Studies from Oberlin College. And so we're very pleased to have had her here, and we're sad that she's going off to really exciting things. I mean, not sad. It's sad she's leaving. I'm very excited that she's going, and it's just been a real pleasure having her here working with us. And so with that, I will stop talking and give you Rebecca.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks everyone for coming out. It's a very busy time of the semester, but try to keep this so we can move on to our things that want to talk. So today I'm going to be presenting on a study, as Lisa mentioned, that I've been working on for the past year and a half, 2 years with colleagues at the Western Water Assessment, looking at small-scale water managers of small-scale water systems in the Western Slope, and looking specifically at how kind of their institutional readiness for using hydroclimatic information in decision-making to manage for drought risks. Before I dive into it, I'll just quickly acknowledge some of the collaborators on this project. A number of PIs at CU, including Ben Livna in Civil Engineering, Lisa, Jeff Lucas, Bill Travis, Eric Kuhn from the Colorado River District, and Nolan Duskin from the Colorado Climate Center. And this project was also supported by a grant from the NOAA SARP program. So just a bit of background on this project and why we were kind of motivated to conduct the study. So for those of you who don't know, the Western Water Assessment is a NOAA-supported regional integrated sciences assessment program, which is we essentially conduct research in partnership with stakeholders in the Rocky Mountain West region to help them make the best use of science to prepare for the impacts of climate variability and climate change. And a big part of what we do at the Western Water Assessment is examining the decision-making contexts of stakeholders in the region with an eye toward understanding how we can kind of improve the production and dissemination of scientific information to support decision-making. So as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, water is a critical and scarce resource throughout the Western US. And with kind of projected rising temperatures with anthropogenic climate change, the kind of timing and volume of snowpack, which is a critical kind of source of storage for us in this region, is expected to change, with more precipitation falling as rain instead of snow, and snowpack melting out earlier and earlier into the year. And so that's going to cause kind of scarcity in terms of water supply availability later in the year, in the summer and fall months when water is most in demand. So there's kind of rising drought risk throughout the region. And in response to this, there's been an increase in investment by scientists, by federal agencies, to produce more scientific information, more drought information to support decision-making among water managers and other stakeholders. And many of these agencies, including the Western Water Assessment, we've engaged in pretty extensive stakeholder engagement processes, what we call co-production, basically soliciting feedback and input from end users, from potential users of the information, to inform the design and dissemination of information products. But it's widely acknowledged that in the usable science community that co-production in this kind of traditional format is very resource intensive, and there's a limit to how much we can do that, how many people we can reach. And so we wanted to look at a kind of a new empirical context, looking at managers of rural small-scale systems that we know we don't really engage with that much currently, to see what we can learn about kind of alternative models for disseminating information, knowing that in the future, with changes in snowpack, we may need to be helping managers kind of change the way they use information to manage drought. So, like I mentioned, the goal of this project was to contribute in-depth empirical descriptions of the information use practices, preferences, and institutional context of small-scale water systems in the Upper Colorado River Basin. And so today I'm just going to talk about a few different components of this. So we looked at factors that motivate or constrain managers to change the way they use information, hydroclimatic information. We looked at kind of characterizing managers' existing knowledge networks and information sources, and as also factors related to the dissemination of information and how that influences their willingness and ability to take up new information. So before I dive into the results of our study, I just want to kind of briefly touch on kind of what our current state of knowledge is about what drives water managers to adopt new information or change the way they use information. So there's a couple different ways to think about it. Dilling and Lemos in 2011 drew the distinction between intrinsic factors, intrinsic determinants of information use, which are related to basically like characteristics of the information products themselves, versus contextual factors, which are related to the kind of institutional and social factors that shape willingness and ability to use information. So some intrinsic factors that are relevant include perceived fit or relevance to decision-making needs, whether a product aligns with the spatial and temporal scale of decisions that are made by the manager, perceived skill, salience, credibility, and legitimacy of the information, as well as accessibility and understandability of the information. How easy is it to interpret what the product is telling you? Some contextual factors include decision makers' management values. So how much do they emphasize routine and reliability versus innovation, for example? Their experiences managing risks in the past. So whether that's managing drought, or whether that's innovating and using a new product and taking on the risk of using a new product, and how that experience went for them and how that shapes kind of how they think about taking risks in the future. And then also whether they have trust in the source of information, the person that they're hearing about the information from. And that's particularly important for water managers. They really generally value localized sector-specific knowledge. One really important contextual factor is the role of capacity, and this kind of plays out in a couple different ways. So technical capacity has been shown to be really important for water managers to have, just to be able to interpret an information product, understand how they can integrate it into their management considerations, and how they can interpret it also in light of other information products that are available to them. Human capacity and resources is shown to be really important for being able to just participate in co-production processes, to like go to workshops, to spend the face time with scientists and like engage in that iterative process. It's very time and resource intensive. And then also a diversity of skills and backgrounds within a particular stakeholder organization has been shown to be useful or kind of support successful co-production outcomes. So those are just examples of the way that capacity plays into this, and I'll touch more on that later as we're intentionally looking at systems that have like lower organizational capacity. I guess given that we know that capacity is an issue, there's been a lot of work around thinking about alternative ways to reach users that are kind of different from the traditional kind of boundary organization model. So the traditional boundary organization model, Western Water System, is an example of a boundary organization. Is the boundary organization that's essentially like focused on the role of that one particular organization and interfacing iteratively with stakeholders. And like I said, this is shown to be a pretty resource intensive process. There's limits to how much we can do this type of work. So one alternative to this is there's a couple different models. One model that's been tested by our colleagues at GLISA, which is our kind of sister organization in the Great Lakes region, is what they call the boundary chain model, which essentially they kind of link multiple boundary organizations together and leverage the kind of different stakeholder relationships, skills, assets that different organizations have, and linking them together to kind of create like a chain effect such that information, we're not just relying on the capacity of one boundary organization, but we can link multiple together to reach end users. And then another model that's been proposed by Califatis et al. 2015 is the idea of like linking, it's kind of similar, but it's linking knowledge networks together. So like linking together a network of, let's say, boundary organizations, federal agencies, scientists that are producing and trying to translate the information, and more sector-specific industry networks, like networks of professionals, and tapping into their kind of sector-specific localized expertise. Linking these two things together to kind of leverage the salience and credibility of a kind of regional knowledge network with the more localized kind of decision-specific expertise of a network of professionals. So these are just examples of different kind of conceptual models that have been put forward to think about different ways we can reach a broader range of users beyond the kind of traditional boundary organization-centric approach. And I'm going to argue that I think this work is really important and we should continue to be thinking about this. But I also think that we need to be spending more time understanding the actual structure of those professional networks. That there's a lot to learn from understanding what those relationships look like within, kind of removing ourselves as the boundary organization and as the producer of information out of the picture, and trying to better understand what it looks like on the ground to be a water manager in terms of your professional network and kind of how we can leverage that. So I'll talk more about that later. But I think one framework that could be useful for us to be able to better understand those professional networks is the diffusion of innovation concept. And essentially what this entails is basically focused on not so much the interaction between the producer of an innovation and the user of an innovation, but the role that different people play within like a group of potential adopters in influencing each other to take up a new innovation. So in this case, the innovation would be use of a hydroclimatic information product, but it could be also any kind of social, technological, or scientific innovation. And so this theory really focuses on the role of the social system. So within a social system defined as a group of people that have some kind of common goal or shared identity, and they are highly shaped by their relationships and norms that are perpetuated within that community. And within kind of a more professionally or like industry-oriented social system, it's also thought that there's sort of a perpetuation of not only shared values and norms, but also shared practices. So in that way, there's sort of like this culture of emulating each other and learning from each other's lessons within a professional social system. And so within diffusion of innovation theory, how and from whom a prospective adopter learns about an innovation matters a lot. So who you hear about an information product from may matter, and how you hear about it may matter a lot. And specifically the role that early adopters play. Early adopters being people who are highly respected, seen to be leaders, but also have a lot of localized knowledge and have the capacity to absorb the risk of innovating, of like using a new product for the first time, but then able to turn around and kind of normalize that risk for other people in their community. So I'll talk more about that later, but that's sort of one way to think about better understanding how water managers interact with each other and the roles that they play. So in terms of the methods for this study, this was a comparative case study design. We looked at 5 water systems across the Western Slope region. We conducted in-depth one-on-one interviews with key decision makers at each organization. So 14 managers total, which is a relatively small number, but these organizations are very small, and in some cases there's like 1 or 2 people who made all the decisions, and so it actually captured a pretty large range of the key decision makers at these 5 systems. We also did a document review, so we reviewed operation plans, drought plans, any kind of like internal memo or board meeting minutes, anything that talked about kind of their decision-making structures, the types of information they used in their decision-making to kind of triangulate what we heard in the interviews. So in terms of our study area, so the Western Slope is, as we all know, it's everything west of the Continental Divide in Colorado, and it also encompasses much of the upper Colorado River Basin. And Water is critical to the economy of the Western Slope as it is for the economy of all of Colorado. But the main kind of economic drivers are irrigated agriculture, ranching, natural resource development, recreation, and there are kind of small populations of smaller municipalities across the region, but it's a widely mountainous and rural area. And yeah, let's see. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the kind of what I mean when I say how water managers use information to make decisions. So water managers, generally speaking, kind of, at least in this region, have kind of a similar calendar of key decisions that they make throughout the year. And they use kind of similar types of products at different times of year to inform their decision making, specifically in regards to managing drought. So I have a lot of really small text on this slide that you can ignore, but basically I've kind of split this into like 4 key seasons throughout the year, just to give you a better sense of what I'm talking about. So the first season being October through December, it's kind of the beginning of what we call a water year. So managers are kind of ramping down from their past use season, and in some cases, water managers that have that are in charge of managing reservoirs will be kind of adjusting reservoir releases to achieve a certain target elevation within their reservoir so that they're prepared for a potential drought in the next year, so they have enough water reserved for the next year. But otherwise, managers are kind of sitting back and waiting for the snow to come. So there's not really a lot that they're doing in the season, they're just kind of observing and waiting to see what happens. The next season is what I'm calling the anticipation and early warning season. So in January through March-ish, hopefully more snow is accumulating. Managers are starting to really dial into the snowpack levels, and in some cases are looking at other products like kind of stream flow forecasts and other products to understand how much water will be available for the year. But in this time of year, it's still kind of too early to make any key decisions. Managers are still kind of choosing to wait to see, what happens later. But there may be some kind of preliminary actions they can take at this time if snowpack is super low. If it's really below average, significantly below average, some managers might be able to ramp up staff resources in preparation for a drought year, for implementing use restrictions, for example, or they may be able to kind of switch their water sources depending on what they want to make sure is available later in the year if it is a dry year. But it isn't until kind of April through June when there's the really key drought management decisions are made. And during this time is the kind of runoff season, and so a lot more information is being used in this time. Weather forecasts are being used pretty actively to try to anticipate the timing of snowmelt, which can really affect, obviously, reservoir operations in terms of filling your reservoir in the spring, but also if you don't have a reservoir, the timing of snowmelt really matters in terms of if you're going to have enough water at the end of the season. If it melts too fast, you might be dry by the time you hit August or September. So this is when a lot of the critical decisions are made and use restrictions might be implemented, or and obviously filling reservoirs is a really key task that has to happen in this time of year. And then by July through September, it's kind of if we're in a drought, you're kind of in ongoing drought management phase. There aren't really more steps to take. You know how much water is going to be available to you, but you're probably going to continue to be monitoring weather forecasts to see if there's going to be a lot of precipitation, or that might affect, depending on how dry it is, that might affect your water supply availability. And so yeah, that's just to give a snapshot of kind of what I mean when I say information use. So there's a lot of different types of information used in different times of the year. So in terms of how we selected our cases, we selected 5 cases that we felt generally represented the range of water systems that can be found across the Western Slope. So with a range of kind of business types, whether they sell wholesale versus retail water, different customer bases, different storage regimes, and then different kind of volume or capacity in terms of the number of people served or the amount of water delivered. So our results. So I'll kind of walk through this in terms of 3 components I highlighted earlier, and then I'll dive into the discussion of kind of what I see as kind of the implications that our results have for how we can understand how to improve information dissemination. So in terms of the intrinsic factors that we heard in our interviews, first and foremost, scale was the most important thing that water managers talked about. They want a product to reflect the geographic scale at which they're operating. So they want something that's going to reflect their specific drainage, and a regional projection of drought in the Western Slope is going to be too large of a geographic scale to be meaningful to them. So scale was a really big thing that came up. One example was a manager who said, the more localized, the more likely I would use it. And that's why most of these tools that are qualitative, we just say they're qualitative because they aren't local enough to necessarily be meaningful. Another theme that came up was the importance of skill. This was more specific to managers who are in charge of managing reservoirs because they're really dependent on forecast products to understand how much water they can expect to be coming into their reservoirs. So I think one example of this was a manager who said it's very critical that we have accurate inflow forecasts for our reservoir. Projections are improving from year to year, but there are still accuracy concerns. Understandability or interpretability of the product also came up, was mentioned by one manager, or one group of managers in particular. Basically, a new product might come out and there may be some assumptions embedded in it, or there may be like another product that's been modeled into it, like soil moisture, for example. But if they're already looking at soil moisture as a standalone product, it's not always clear that there's those redundancies, and so being able to really understand what the assumptions are embedded in the product was really important. So, as the manager put it, there was some built-in inertia toward using existing information instead of adopting new information, because when a new tool comes along, somebody has to explain what's factored into the tool. In terms of contextual factors, so factors associated with the kind of institutional or social forces that shape their adoption, of willingness to adopt information, capacity came up very clear, came up very loudly as a clear theme that these managers really feel like they're at a pretty significant disadvantage as compared to their peers in the region, larger scale organizations in the region. And that came up in a number of ways, in terms of perceiving that they don't have the ability to have the in-house technical expertise that's required to be able to meaningfully incorporate information into their decision making, but also that they just don't have the time to even be looking for information. They're wearing multiple hats. One manager might be in charge of all of the operations of their system, and so even being able to consider the existence of information beyond what's in front of them that's a challenge for them. It's not that they don't want to, they just don't have the time to do that. So just one example of a manager who said, if you look at the Front Range, you get that intensity, those large organizations that are very, very well staffed, very well skilled, and so forth. And you look at the Western Slope, there's no one organization that can even come close. And this was a very clear theme that came up across a number of interviewees. Past experience also came up as an example, as something that shaped whether they were going to be willing to consider using new information. So for one system in particular, they had previously relied on operational forecast products to manage the reservoir, and they over time felt that they weren't accurate enough and they were leading them to make bad decisions, those forecasts were. And then it wasn't until the 2002 drought where it really was a kick in the butt, and they were like, we really need to change what we're doing. And so they basically completely shifted off of using any forecast products to just look at using snowpack observation data to drive their decision making. And so just an example of how their past experience using information and managing drought was really propelling them to change their behavior. So this manager said, this was an internal memo that they shared with me that kind of documented their reasoning for changing their operational model. The proposed system, being their new kind of snowpack-based model, is more conservative than relying upon early season forecasts, but it also guarantees that demands will be met even in the event of a busted official forecast. So it's just a more conservative approach to managing their system. And then generational turnover also was a theme that came up. Mostly was raised as an example of a positive, providing a window of opportunity to change the way that they use information. And also the kind of new skills that younger staff can bring into an organization in terms of the kind of technical capacity to understand and use new products. So one manager explained, we have a lot of newer employees in our department that are well versed with that sort of thing, looking in forecasts and using technology. So it was kind of explaining why they felt more prepared for drought than they felt in the past because of new people that had come in. So in terms of the managers' interviewees' current knowledge networks and where they're currently finding out about information. So most of the managers accessed their information directly from agency websites and portals. So, for example, from NRCS, USGS, and NOAA, and that they, in terms of hearing about a new product, they were mostly hearing about products from industry organizations. So not research groups, not universities, but like the American Water Works Association, the Colorado Water Congress, Colorado River District. These are examples of groups, of sources of new information. Surprisingly, the managers we interviewed really had little or no interaction with kind of what I'm calling boundary activities. So like Western Water's climate dashboard, or the drought early warning drought briefings that are put on by the Colorado Climate Center at CSU. Those types of like regional resources they really hadn't heard of, or they'd heard of them but they had never participated. So that was kind of an interesting finding. Another interesting thing that came up was the role that industry peers played in both as a source of new information and also as a kind of interpreter of information for these managers. So for example, one manager explained that it wasn't that, so he used, when I asked him what types of products he used and he was listing them off, and we came to the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center's forecast product, the CBRFC forecast, he explained that, you know, he doesn't actually look at it himself, but he does have this one guy, this one buddy that he calls up at another system, and he basically just relies on this person to kind of provide a local assessment of what's happening, and he knows that that person is looking at all these other products, and so through him he's able to like benefit from those products, but he's not going on looking at them. So this is just a quote from him. So in the springtime, he, being his buddy, is in daily communication with the River Forecast Center on what's expected. He gives us the big picture of what's happening everywhere on the West Slope. I don't know how he does it. Basically, you get him on the line, you just say, what's happening this year? Do you see anything that's out of the ordinary? Mm-hmm. So this was really, then a couple other managers had similar examples of, there were kind of key people or key organizations that they would kind of call up or, you know, go to their kind of like regular meetings to understand, like, well, what do you see is happening? And we know that you're looking at all the products out there, but we're gonna get your take on what's happening. So yeah, and then in terms of a few factors that we saw related to the dissemination of information that influenced whether they would change the way they use information. So familiarity with the information source was seen as to be important. They wanted to be familiar with the agency they were hearing about an information product from. There was value placed on whether the source of information, the person or the agency had hands-on experience managing a reservoir or managing a water system. So they, you know, hearing about a source from an actual water manager is going to be a lot more valuable than hearing about it from like a university researcher or a federal agency. So this manager said, if we heard from someone who had been trying in practice, you bet. If I talk to the River Basin Forecast Center, who does this kind of stuff for huge scale reservoirs and operations that have many moving parts and considerations, you bet I'm going to listen to those guys. And then another example that we heard, another thing that came up was the idea of wanting to see a product having been proven successful in another water system. They wanted to see someone else implement and show and demonstrate that that product can be predicted for a water system, or help improve that decision making before they're willing to consider using that information product themselves. So one manager explained that what we really trust is when someone shows up and says, hey, look, we started looking into whatever parameter and it has actually given us better results. If someone can come to me with that they had an idea, that they tested it, and they saw some positive results, you bet we're gonna look at that. So yeah, this was, I think, an interesting theme in terms of, you know, what it takes for someone to really want to change the way they, you know, change their behavior around information use. So in terms of kind of how we can kind of make sense of all these findings, in terms of understanding how small systems are different from bigger systems, which most of the literature on kind of determinants of information use are looking at larger scale systems. There really haven't been any studies that have like systematically looked at kind of smaller scale water organizations. So some similarities that our findings had with the literature was that, you know, the basic needs around the information products, those intrinsic factors, like they want to see scale, they want the right scale, they want understandability, those were all pretty consistent. Also the role that past experience played in shaping their willingness to use information, that was also consistent. And the role that generational differences and staff turnover can play in opening a window of opportunity to change information use behavior. Capacity also came up obviously as a key barrier, and we did see examples of how technical capacity was important or was seen to be a key barrier in terms of being able to integrate information products into decision making. Lack of financial resources to acquire that technical capacity if you don't have it in-house, the ability to hire a consultant or some kind of external support to be able to integrate information. But we also saw that this really just basic lack of staff capacity that hasn't really come up in other studies, where capacity is seen as necessary for participating in co-production, but in the case of these like extremely small organizations, the capacity to just pay attention, to even consider looking for new products, like to even be able to spend an hour a day on the internet looking to see what's out there, that's kind of, that's difficult for them. And so they're wearing, like I said, they're wearing multiple hats. Searching for new information is not a priority if what they have is working. So that's just, an interesting thing that came up looking at these small organizations. Another, I think, important finding is that these managers are clearly very embedded within their professional networks, within their industry networks, and that they're relatively insulated from interactions with universities and other kind of boundary organizations. So their sources of information were relatively narrow. They mostly engaged with industry groups. Like I said, they didn't really interact, they didn't really participate in some of the kind of main activities like webinars and things that we kind of see as the main platforms to engage between producers and users of information. They heavily relied on their industry peers, both for sources of information as well as like assessment of local conditions. And in terms of understanding why this is the case, I mean, probably part of it is that they're not, they're on the Western Slope, they're far away from like CU, from CSU, from these universities that have a lot of these ongoing activities. But also probably more important is that there's a lower transaction cost for them in terms of following in the footsteps of people they really trust, people they know who have the capacity to be looking and like engaging directly with these kind of information producers. It's easier for them to just kind of go through them and take what they have to say at face value and trust that they're doing the hard work to integrate that information and like translate it into their local context. Also, I think our findings suggest that we kind of need to be evolving the way we think about adoption, information adoption for these types of water managers. And adoption might not be like directly going and looking at a product or like either going to that website or engaging in the types of like webinars and activities that information producers put on, but that they may be going through their peers, both in terms of calling up that guy and seeing what he has to say about what's happening, but also seeing what other water systems are using and seeing what has been proven successful in those systems before they're going to consider using it in their own. So yeah, and I think this kind of implies that the role of early adopters is really important, and we can kind of start to think about how can we identify who the early adopters are in our particular region, and fitting that early adopter profile that's basically like somebody who has localized knowledge but is also respected by their peers, and someone who has the capacity to be kind of wrangling with new products, figuring out how it could be useful, and then translating that into something that can be trusted and used directly by smaller scale system managers. So I think in terms of like what this means for like what the solution is, I think in an ideal world, we would be able to bring more resources to these water systems on the Western Slope, and we would be able to bring resources to the table, so we could provide like highly individualized, tailored technical assistance that a number of consultants already do in the region, but they cost money, and these organizations don't have the resources to hire that kind of support. And so this was actually raised by a couple of different managers that we interviewed, the need for this like free or low cost individualized support. One manager said, if you somehow had some resources that could even be shared across the Western Slope water system, that starts to fulfill the intellectual capacity of the Western slope, that would help. Like in reference to some kind of shared like consultant or like technical resource who can like provide that individualized support across the region. Another person said, I'd like to see someone being able to produce products for rural communities and small communities. The science is there, the tools are there. There's no reason why these tools shouldn't be made available for all communities, so that even the smaller water user groups can make the same information and analysis that someone like Denver Water or the Bureau of Reclamation is using. So just this idea of like equitable access to information and how do we make that happen? You know, that is kind of an obvious answer, but that's kind of in an ideal world. If we had like infinite number of resources, we could definitely make that happen. But the reality is we are in a resource constrained world, and organizations like the Western Water Assessment or other boundary organizations, like, you know, there's only so much we can do to try to access or kind of broaden the community of people that we're reaching in our mission. And so I think these results suggest that there is room for refining the way that we think about dissemination, particularly the kind of capacity constraints that we see, the insulation from boundary activities, and the like deep trust in local knowledge and hands-on experience. I think we may want to consider just the fact that maybe we shouldn't expect these managers to ever participate in a webinar or in come look at our dashboard. Like that might not ever happen, and that's okay. But I think we need to just think about like what are realistic, like how do we define success for what those types of activities are. And I think it's really important that we capitalize on these communities of practice, like these very tight-knit industry and professional networks where people are relying on each other and helping each other kind of like evolve and make progress. And that doesn't, I think, you know, taking ourselves out of the picture a little bit and trying to focus more on understanding how those communities of practice are structured, who are those key early adopters, you know, that could be really beneficial. And in terms of like what this means concretely, I mean, we could consider, and I think we kind of already do this, but like more strategically engaging with early adopters, identifying who those key people are, like who is that person that people call up, and like can we engage with that person, and if there is a new product we want to be promoting, can we be strategically targeting those people first, and then somehow providing some kind of support to then like help to disseminate their experience, either testing out a new product or helping to get the word out. And maybe it's not us that plays that role as well, but just thinking more about different ways that boundary organizations can engage in that way. And as I said earlier, the early adopter profile, like thinking about how we can use that concept to identify who those key people are. And, you know, a number of names came up just in the 14 interviews I did alone. So there's definitely people out there that we can be, you know, tapping into to be able to reach that broader community. And yeah, so I think there needs to become some follow-up work to this to be able to like execute and make this happen. I mean, in terms of the observations made in this study, I think it would be useful to kind of test our observations on a larger sample. You know, we only looked at 5 organizations, and it is there are a lot of different types of water systems in the Western Slope and in the Upper Colorado River Basin. So it would be useful to like do a broader study, kind of building off of this one. It'd also be useful to do kind of a more targeted comparative study looking at small versus large scale systems to kind of tease out like what the way that capacity plays out, or the way that capacity plays a role in this, as opposed to just, you know, I'm kind of comparing this to what we are reading in the literature, but doing a more comparative study could be useful. And I think the big recommendation would be to do some kind of social network analysis, like really take the time to map out who all these players are, who those early adopters are, who those innovators are, and then see, you know, from there how we can be more strategic about how we engage with stakeholders. And then the idea of kind of demoing new products on water systems first, and then that, you know, enabling replication among smaller water managers. I think that could be tested and studied a little bit more. It's like an interesting idea that has come up in a couple different places, but maybe doing a longer term study to see the effects of demonstration projects to see, like, does that really work? Would people actually would that be an effective strategy for kind of scaling up an information product? And yeah, that's it. I'll take questions.
Questions? I have a question. managers, are there any people, so for example, they mentioned like Bureau of Rec underwater. Is there people they don't want to listen to, even though they are early adopters or high capacity because there's some political reason or something? You know, I can see people on the West Slope not liking some stuff on the East Slope. So
Yeah.
is there any of that, or do
Not
they
that
not
I
really
heard
care?
of. I mean, I feel like the only thing I really heard was that they want to be talking to actual water managers. But, I mean, that's something that I was wondering, like, yeah, in terms of the geography, slope-west slope divide. I mean, Denver Water was brought up frequently as an example of a high-capacity, high-functioning organization, but in terms of how much they would really interact with managers at Denver Water, like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure how frequently that would happen. But yeah, like, managers at the River District and the, like, Western Slope Bureau of Rec people, that came up more frequently as. So it'd be interesting to explore that more, I think. And like what venues do those managers, and what brings those people together and how frequently, and yeah, if there's more research to be done.
I was thinking about the role of individuals because those are also, like you said, turnover in the organizations, those roles, those key individuals can turn over as well. And what happens to the system when the guy that everybody calls moves on or something, it's sort of a big gap.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking those individuals, what makes them trusted versus like, what if they're kind of sort of overconfident in a way, like they're saying, oh yeah, that's what's gonna happen, but then it doesn't actually happen. But are they able to, maybe that works 1 year and then they're like out of the picture because
Right.
they're like, you're full of it. But
Yeah.
I mean, it puts a lot of power in that person's hands to do a good job at interpreting and so forth. It'd be interesting to study them, I guess, too, like those key people.
Yeah, I did hear of examples of people who, like an older generation of managers who really, were highly trusted at the Bureau of Rec, for example, and then they're being turned over and a loss of trust in the new set of managers, but then over time, like seeing that they were getting better at what they were doing and then going back in and relying on them again. So it must, I think it's kind of dynamic, but
Takes build up.
yeah. Alex.
Kind of similar to that question, did you talk to any of the managers about how they developed that trust with the advisors? Or what that process looked
Yeah,
like?
no, I didn't look at that specifically. I mean, I think like some of these people have been in their jobs for 30 years, and so it's like the other guys have been around for 30 years, who are managing those larger scale systems, and have also maybe they probably have like a mandate to be interacting with some of the information providers more than these local system managers have, and so that probably also makes it so that, it's more likely that they're going to be relied upon for their perspective. But yeah, I didn't ask that specifically. It's interesting to think about what it means to be in an industry for like multiple decades and having clear like key leaders that move on or retire and what that does to the community practice. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious just about what are some of the kind of metrics these water managers are assessed on, and who's providing them with feedback. It seems like it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't adopt new things if what they're doing is working, if it's kind of a high stakes, sort of a risk averse decision-making environment versus, it's okay to make mistakes. Like, how are they being held accountable, and how did that factor into some of the things that you
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the key measure of success is delivering water.
Right.
And so, making sure water, like you turn on the tap and there's water flowing, and they're delivering on their contracts that they have to irrigators and whatnot. So I mean, I think this is sort of implied in an assumption in this study is that in the future, the environment is going to change enough such that managers are going to have to change the information that they use. And snowpack, for example, which is like heavily relied upon as the key indicator of drought, that may not be a good indicator in the future, that we don't really know. So it's sort of like, this is kind of like in a theoretical future when information products aren't working as well and managers are not they're not managing drought as tightly as they once were able to. Like under that situation, they would in theory be motivated to change the way they use information because they're not delivering water, or like there's more like problems coming up in drought years that would drive them to want to change. Like observing that, I mean, we ask people like, have you seen changes in robustness of the indicators you use? Like has snowpack continued to be has it led you to make the right decisions, basically? And so far, they've said yes, and they haven't observed any changes, but that might shift in the future, but it is ultimately about delivering the water and being held accountable by their constituents.
I guess this wasn't necessarily the focus of the study, but did you get into some of those, like you mentioned 2002 drought, did you talk to some of these people about, what happens when there isn't a right decision to be made, right? It's not that I did something wrong myself, it's that there just wasn't enough water in the system, and so I couldn't fulfill that contract or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization. Like, so for utilities, if you mess up, like there's going to be major political backlash, yeah, I mean, I think that's different than if for like a irrigation district or a conservancy district that has set contracts with a set number of irrigators, and yeah, if there's not enough water that year, there's nothing they can do about it, and there's nothing the irrigators can do about it, and like they might get there may be some tension around like, did they make any wrong decisions around like managing the reservoir that year, and like there will be that kind of attention after the fact. But I think for utilities, it's a much bigger problem in terms of like reliability of providing that service. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, I think interestingly, like it doesn't, from what I've heard, it doesn't go back to information always. Like, yeah, there's a lot of, competing issues when you're talking about drought management and what you can really do about it when there isn't enough water, and like who is held accountable. But in terms of how that reflects on like changing information use, I think information is limited in terms of how much it can really help you do your job.
Yeah, if there's not water, it doesn't matter with the information.
Right. It could help in terms of long range planning and like building other options so that there's more water supply, for example.
So this, to some extent, follows on that question, and that is there were two very severe drought years in the last 20 years that have, we'll say, stressed most, if not all, of these systems, 2002 and 2012. And Eric Kuhn at the Colorado River District has indicated that he has seen since 2002 generally a shift to more conservatism in management, and particularly managing reservoir storage. And I was wondering if that was borne out in your individual interviews, whether people spoke, specifically spoke to 2002 and or 2012, and if they talked about, we've become more conservative over time or shifted our practices because of what we experienced in those one or both years. And I think this goes to his question in that systems over time tend to get calibrated to the so that they are reliably delivering, in all but maybe the exception is all but the most extreme drought years, with there being more tolerance of partial deliveries if it's irrigation district for ag users than for retail municipal customers. But in either case, there's still this conditional expectation, you could say, of water delivery, that if there's 50% of normal snowpack on April 1st, no one expects to see everything that they're allotted or promised, but they expect to know on April 1st from their water system that they should to expect curtailments of use in some fashion or another. But anyway, did 2002 and 2012 come up, and what was the context?
Yeah, that's like a whole other
separate
thing.
paper.
I decided not to talk about it. It's 5 minutes here, but I mean, I think Eric's comment about the effect that those droughts had on like conservatism. In this part of the project, I was looking at that, like in terms of how that had changed the way people were willing to use information specifically. And I mean, there was the example of this one system who they stopped using forecast products altogether. They used the word conservative. Like, this new solution is more conservative than what we were doing before, and they made that change only after 2012. 2012. I mean, they knew they needed it, but it wasn't until 2012 where they were like, okay, we're doing this now. We're going to invest in this new operational model. But in terms of like general practices, I mean, yeah, I saw a number of examples of systems managers who made significant changes after those droughts, and mostly around like, well, both in terms of their capacity to do like emergency kind of like drought management during the droughts, as well as like long range planning and making major investments in augmenting water supply and whatnot. But there were also examples of systems that haven't changed anything at all.
Yeah. Were there any other examples besides the one you cited of folks who decided to change their information use or adopt new
but in the
information?
opposite direction. Yeah. So like there were a couple managers who said nothing was super concrete, but people who said, well, we started paying attention more. We started dialing into this webinar a little more often. Or it's also hard to say because especially since 2002, like technology and I mean, it's just changed so much.
The landscape of information.
They're kind of like, well, there's tons of more information available to us
Right.
now. So like that has been a change, but wasn't like they couldn't attribute that to their drought experience per se. But yeah, there was some more willingness to like look at what's out there, I think, among a couple managers. But
But you did have that opposite
then
case
there's
where
also opposite
abandoned
case as
use of
well.
forecasting.
Well, but you could say they shifted to something that they thought was more reliable.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I didn't see any
they,
other than
they became more discerning, you could say, because of that experience.
Yeah, I didn't see any other examples of like actually changing information use, more just like adding on, looking at more stuff that's out there. But, Any other questions, comments? Thanks for coming.
Any online, Amy?
No.
Well, thank you again for coming.
Thank you.